Welcome to our first panel, Social and Political Functions of Abnormality. We'll start by hearing all the papers and then move on to questions for all three speakers, so please make a note of your questions and save them to the end. Giving the first paper, we have Jennifer Duggan from Sør-Trøndelag University College in Trondheim, Norway. Jennifer's paper is titled Screw Loose, the Evolution of a Maddening Idiom.
So hello, it's lovely to be here today. As you heard, my name is Jennifer and I'm here from Norway, although you can probably hear I'm originally from Canada. My research tends to have a science and literature focus, and my current pet interest is the Victorian brain and machine. I say is and not are because I'm interested in how the brain and the machine are interconnected in Victorian literature, science, and culture. So this paper is part of my ongoing research into why and how the brain came during the 19th century to be pictured or understood as a machine or even as machine-like. Even today, we continue to use the 19th century metaphor of a machine to understand how the brain works, despite our understanding of it as functioning in a very different and organic way than a machine functions. We talk about the brain as mechanical. We still today use idioms like to be hardwired to do something. We talk about our circuitry or wiring. We think of our brains as functioning like computers most often. If someone has a rough patch and ceases to function in social norms, we say that they are suffering a breakdown. And when someone is thinking hard, we refer to their pistons firing or their cogs turning, and sometimes we even talk about our brain as the machinery or the machine. Now, I feel that I must mention that the term machine had a different meaning in the 18th century than it came to have during the industrialized 19th century. I don't have enough time today to talk about this limitation of my research, but I do hope to eventually discuss the nuances of this term in future conference papers. Researchers have already shown that in industrial England, humans were often figured as parts of machines, and often as the thinking parts. Humans were not discrete actors and workers, but inseparable organic and mechanical links in a greater system. In Tamara Katakian's article, Arel's Cotton Factory, Stockport, 1835, she recounts George Dodd's impression in the June 1843 Penny magazine of workers within the cotton factory. The factory is a scene of clattering, hard-working machines on all sides, with the heads of the 650 females just above them, a figurative effacement of human workers into mere body parts, heads visible above machinery as fragmented human organs in the factory's hybrid network. And as industrialization continued, humans began to be subsumed by and conflated with machines within the social imaginary as well, as is evident in a number of 19th century publications, like those of Ruskin and Carlyle, or through the frequent and often fearful references to humans acting as automatons, or automatons masquerading as humans, which you can read about in detail in Fiona Cole's recent dissertation, or by simply scanning through the stories in magazines. A particularly good example is D. Christie Murray's 1877 penny dreadful story, Frightened with False Fire, in which a scientist who uses lobotomy to make a frog, a mere automaton, eventually ends up lobotomizing a human subject, who is also referred to in mechanistic language as a machine, a helpless figure, and an automaton. Incidentally, the first human lobotomy actually was performed a decade after this story was published in Switzerland by Johann Gottlieb Burckhardt. As to this paper, it is a portion of this research focusing on 19th century metaphors, common collocations, and idioms that refer to the brain as mechanical, which I hope will be able to show an exponential increase through the 19th century of a socio-cultural understanding of the brain as a machine. This particular work is perhaps closer to cultural or socio-linguistics than literature per se, And I've used a huge number of sources, so I only have works cited for the ones that I actually quote today, because I have referred to more than 500. And if you're interested in any specific sources, you're welcome to ask me. So I've largely used the 19th century British periodicals, the British periodicals and the Happy Trust digital archives and databases to build a corpora of texts, which is my data set. Sadly, this is not and never could be a comprehensive list, as the phrase is a slang term. And it tends to be used, because it's a slang term, in less auspicious publications more often than in well-regarded periodical publications. It's very likely that it was used much more frequently in private letters and in speech than in published documents. In fact, the published documents I have found suggest that even as early as the 1820s, they refer to the term "to have a screw loose" as an old saying, but you can't find it very often in publications before around 1810. So that is quite interesting. However, this does not mean that the published documents are not indicative of its changes in meaning over time. It's just important that we keep in mind the limitations of researching slang in published documents as opposed to in speech, which would obviously be impossible in the 19th century. Right. Several researchers of cultural linguistics have shown quite convincingly that phrase or word usage within specific languages reflect widely held cultural understandings and beliefs. I really would recommend Anne Rusbicka's oeuvre if you're interested in how this functions in sociolinguistics. We take it for granted today that the idiom "to have a screw loose" refers to someone whose head isn't screwed on quite right, someone whose brain cells aren't firing the way that they should, someone who is more than a little eccentric or perhaps closer to mentally ill. But this was not always the case. So I'm going to talk now about how "to have a screw loose" became associated with mental instability during the long 19th century, as well as the meanings it held prior to this and the puns it provoked. And of course, these sociocultural understandings of the human mind that influenced its inculcation as a mind-related metaphor. To the present, there's been no scholarship on the origin of the idiom. My present research indicates that the idiom originated in England in the late 1700s, before spreading to other languages like German, eine Schaberlocker haben, and Norwegian, ein skrueris, in which the phrase also refers to mental instability. I can't talk about this cross-cultural comparison today, so you'll just have to trust me on that. The idiom originated in the late 18th century, as I mentioned. If one compares Francis Gross's original, a classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue, aka his slang dictionary, published in 1785, with later editions like Paul Egan's 1823, Gross's classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue, revised and corrected with the addition of numerous slang phrases collected from tried authorities. Excellent title. One finds that screw loose is only included in the latter version, although its listed meaning does not at this point include mental instability. It is in magazines published in the Victorian period that the phrase began to be increasingly associated with insanity or mental instability. In the Oxford English Dictionary's entry for screw, "to have a screw loose" is listed as meaning to be eccentric, insane, or mentally retarded. The first listed example of the use of screw loose to connote mental instability in the dictionary is from an 1810 edition of Sporting magazine, which states in the original, "The others, to use the fashionable term, have got a screw loose." However, this is actually an incorrect interpretation of the use of the idiom by the OED. The writer was, if you examine the original publication, and it was in a Sporting magazine, referring to a horse race and talking about the horses that didn't perform well. This was the most common usage at the beginning of the 19th century. How do I know this? Well, let's first explore the various meanings of "to have a screw loose" throughout the 19th century. Generally speaking, "to have a screw loose" was used to indicate if something was wrong with anything at all. but it tended to be applied in very specific instances over the century. These included, first of all, physical idleness, abnormality, or injury, especially of horses and humans, but sometimes foxes. Something wrong with an institution, especially a financial institution or the government, but also occasionally theaters, church groups, and others. Abnormalities in relationships, especially disagreements causing people to act abnormally towards one another. Suspicious things, especially as relates to crimes, and especially as relates to crimes involving money, like embezzlement. Something wrong with a woman, usually regarding her moral character, but also sometimes her temperament, which is, of course, related to mental functioning. And finally, although rather rarely, something wrong with nature, such as a failure in the crops. It was also quite commonly used in puns, for example, as relates to the word crew when discussing rowing. There was a screw loose, something went wrong with the crew. Or as relates to the slang term for a horse, which was screw. And they often punned upon this when they talked about women as well, because women were talked about as fillies, horses, and then you had several layers of meaning to the term. In order to get a picture of the evolution in meaning over time, we need to see how it was used over time, and how common each usage was. So I've therefore coded the hundreds of examples that I have had time to analyze by meaning and by decade, and have plotted them in charts. These have allowed me to draw a number of useful conclusions. I wish to note that in my calculations, I've left out any repeat prints of the same article, because often articles were published in various newspapers around the country several times. So I've only used those articles once, no matter how many times they were reprinted. I have also left out the surprisingly few and far between instances of screw loose being used in reference to actual machinery with physical screws loose. I've come across only 9 such instances during the whole century, which is quite an interesting finding in itself. The uses of screw loose generally related to steamships or trains with mechanical problems or accidents in factories causing injury. But as I mentioned, there were only 9 such instances throughout the century that I have found so far. In a very few cases, too, the articles had to be left out because they were entirely illegible. However, there were only 3 such articles, so this is not statistically important in a corpora of over 500. The first and most important conclusion we can draw from my findings is that not only did the use of the idiom change over time, but it also increased over time. In the 1820s, it was used very little. In the 1830s, usage increased. I have 76 examples so far from this decade. By the 1840s, usage had further increased. To date, I have 235 samples coded, but I have more samples to hand from this decade. And although I haven't yet managed to code all of the nearly 4,000 examples I've found, I can tell you that the usage continues to increase throughout the century, and that the 1880s and 90s have as almost more than the rest of the century. The second conclusion we can draw is that the usage at the beginning of the century was less fixed than it was later in the century. This may seem commonsensical, but it is also something we should strive to show through research. The 2 most common usages of the term have nothing to do with actual physical screws, and it was also likely already used metaphorically prior to its appearance in the periodical press. So during the first half of the century, the majority of the instances of usage referred to 2 things: horses with health issues, that is, injury or illness, that weren't performing well in races, and something wrong in politics, institutions, or societies. So you can see here, this is in the 1840s where it's increased, it's shifted a little bit, but you can see that the majority of cases, 53%, is something wrong with an institution, politics, or society, and about 20% is something wrong with a horse in a horse race. During the 1820s and 30s, for example, only 1 datum containing to have a screw loose referred to mental instability. This represents just 1.2% of the data set for the 2 decades. In the 1840s, however, I found 17 examples, as you can see here, representing 70.2% of the data set. By the 1850s, usage of screw loose to represent mental instability had increased to 11.8%. And in the latter half of the century, it refers to mental instability 27.7% of the time. So nearly 1/3 of all usages after 1850 refer to mental instability. You can see here in 1860, it's up to 24%, and by 1890, it's 29%. So what could have influenced this change in usage and in accepted meaning? Well, Britain at the beginning of the century was not a big player in brain-related sciences. In fact, one could argue that these sciences didn't really exist so much in Britain in the first half of the century. On the continent, however, scientists' interests in brain function had grown. But most scientists who examined the brain's function found it to be plastic at this time. That is, they found that the brain did not necessarily function as a machine with discrete parts performing specific functions. Scientists such as Marie-Jean-Pierre Floren in France and Friedrich Gultz in Germany found that although animals lost function when parts of their brains were removed, they eventually were able to regain the majority of these functions over time, when given enough time. However, as Norman Deutsch argues, when studies of brain function reached England, influenced by later debunked ideas such as phrenology, scientists sought to show that the brain was localized. That is, that the brain had specific parts that functioned in and only in specific ways, and that the function of these parts was non-transferable. So if those parts of the brain were removed, the function would be irrevocably lost. This means that only one part of the brain could perform one function. Both Robert M. Young and Robert H. Wozniak have suggested that the work of scientists John Hewlings Jackson and David Ferrier became the most popular in England. Their work co-opted these earlier studies by scientists such as Florenz and Gultz, whom I mentioned, so that the loss of function associated with lobotomy continued to be discussed and argued, but they argued instead, as Deutsch puts it, the brain had to be understood as the dynamic whole, and that it was premature to assume that mental functions had an invariant location in the brain. So that was largely ignored. They argued for localization. What is interesting about this is that the work of Hewlings, Jackson, and Ferrier took place relatively late in the century. The former published the majority of his neurological works in the late 1860s and 1870s, while the latter published in the 1870s and early 1880s. Their work helped to firmly establish localization theory, and indeed, Ferrier produced largely inaccurate maps of the mind and its areas as related to function. He was also one of the first scientists in a study with several continental brain scientists to apply electricity to the brain as a stimulant in an attempt to discover how the brain communicated and what parts of the brain communicated with what parts of the body. It was around this same time, in the 1870s and 1880s, that both Brain and Mind magazines began to be published, establishing the brain sciences as a distinct branch of medicine and research. But this all postdates an increasing shift towards a sociocultural idea of the brain as mechanical, as we can see through the increasing application of the metaphor to have a screw loose to abnormal brain function, manifested in mad or at least odd behavior. As I stated earlier, by the 1850s, 11.8% of the instances of use of to have a screw loose were related to madness or mental abnormality, up from 1.2% in the decades prior. This suggests that the concept of the brain as a machine predates the medical studies that sought to show that the brain functioned as a machine, that is, in a localized manner, with discrete parts performing singular functions, parts that could malfunction, just as the parts of the machine, and be the cause of abnormal function or of breakdown of mental processes. The relation to machines was extremely clear in the usage too. Take, for example, this quote from the Standard newspaper. I I only have 1 minute, so I'm going to rush this, of 6 May 1846 regarding Mr. Daniel Webster of the American Department of State in England. It is sometimes said of a man borrowing a figure from mechanics that there is a screw loose about him. But this man's whole machine was deranged. All the screws were loose. The entire frame was rickety, disjointed, crazy. His mind was so bizarre that it was incapable of producing anything but a bungled mist. So you can see that the first instances of screw loose as related to abnormal brain function came from politics, to discuss politicians' mad behavior. And they didn't mince words, did they? And another excellent example, titled Concerning the Advantages of Being a Cantankerous Fool, with some thoughts on the treatment of incapacity, from Fraser's magazine in 1866, says, yes, my reader, if you want to be deferred to, humored, made much of, if you want to have everybody about you trying to persuade you to act as a sensible man would act without any persuasion, and everybody quite pleased and happy if you've been got after much difficulty into the right track, see that you set yourself in the important and influential character of an ill-tempered and wrong-headed fool. The loose screws in the machine, they are the important things. People think of them, watch them. I'll cut myself short there because I'm running out of time. But you can see in both of these, and particularly in the earlier example, that there is a clear connection of brain abnormality with the mechanical and mechanical malfunction. My research so far suggests, therefore, that the already extant British sociocultural view of the brain as mechanical or as machine-like, shown through example the idioms that I've explored today, have or may have at least influenced the ways in which British scientists investigated and interpreted brain function, and have influenced the brain sciences as well as our understanding as a culture of the brain as a machine. Thank you.
So next on the panel we have Lara Green from Northumbria University. Her paper is titled, and I should have checked the pronunciation with you, shouldn't I? Sergei Stepniak, yeah, fantastic, and his exceptional terrorists, subverting dominant representations of Russian terrorists for the English reading public, 1883 to 1895.
Thanks. Okay. So English newspaper readers first encountered Russian terrorism following the attempted assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1866. On April the 4th in St. Petersburg, Dmitry Karakazov, who's shot at the Tsar but he missed. Press coverage of the affair in Russia attacked Karakazov and praised the peasant who supposedly saved the Tsar by knocking into him before he fired. This quote from the Times shows that the English press coverage of the incident depicted Karakazov as a socially isolated and self-destructive figure, which was similar to the way in which Russian critics depicted young revolutionaries in the 1860s. English newspapers frequently used the term nihilist to refer to Russian revolutionaries, a term that had been popularized in Russia by Ivan Turgenev in his 1862 novel Fathers and Sons, which had depicted the antagonism between the generation of radicals who became active in the 1860s and their predecessors, who called them the nihilists. English newspapers often generalized Russian revolutionaries under this term without distinguishing between their political views. So one aspect of the negative stereotype of nihilism was extreme asceticism, but this was also glorified by Russian revolutionary writers. In Nikolai Chernyshevsky's 1863 novel, What Is to Be Done, the character Rakhmetov exhibits extreme ascetic tendencies, such as sleeping on a bed of nails, as part of his efforts for self-improvement. This novel was taken by many revolutionaries as a model for their lifestyles, and they're not recorded to have tried the bed of nails. More often than not, they were inspired by its depictions of communal living. Rakhmetov's behaviour was obviously extreme, and Fyodor Dostoevsky's early work, Notes on the Underground, is often perceived to be a parody of What Is to Be Done. Observers also became more hostile towards this extreme ascetic image because of the Chayev affair, in which a Russian revolutionary, Sergei Chayev, promoted such a lifestyle in his Catechism of the Revolutionary, which was a secret document discovered in a raid in 1869. but he caused a scandal when he encouraged his terrorist cell to help him murder one of their own because he believed he was a police spy. In this paper, I will mainly use the book Underground Russia to illustrate how its author depicted Russian terrorism for English readers in terms of both negative stereotypes, nihilism, and also exceptionalism. I will look at the role of his writing about terrorism popularising Russian political and social causes, and the influence of underground Russia on English fiction that appealed to popular tastes. The words terrorism and terrorist feature throughout this book, and I use them more broadly in my research to look at targeted violence for the purpose of achieving political, social or economic change, or as a means of inciting revolution to achieve the same ends. The book's author, Sergei Mikhailovich Kravchinsky, who was known in Europe exclusively by his pseudonym Stepniak, was a Russian revolutionary who had taken part in propaganda efforts to incite revolution among peasants and workers in the mid-1870s. After his arrest for propaganda activities, Stepniak escaped and travelled to Europe, where he took part in an anarchist uprising in Italy in 1877. But it was the events of 1878 that marked the start of Stepniak's involvement in terrorism and writing about terrorism. This was the year that Vera Zazulich shot the governor of St. Petersburg for ordering the illegal flogging of a political prisoner. When she was arrested, she said she had done it because she wanted to draw attention to the case. Throughout her trial, her lawyers depicted her as a lone actor and carefully downplayed her socialist views. This was very different to the trial of Kravtsov, in which his socialist views and supposed terrorist cell membership were central. And obviously this translated then into the press reporting of the case, both in Russia and in England. Zazulich was actually acquitted by the jury, which was a result of the quirk in the Russian justice system that allowed a jury to acquit on conscience, even if the defendant had admitted to the crime. And in the course of her trial, Zazulich came to represent justice and her victim, the despotic regime, which attracted more supporters to her cause. And when Stepniak heard about what Zazulich had done, he wrote a pamphlet called A Death for a Death, which was actually only ever available in Russian, in which he called for acts of terrorism against representatives of the despotic Tsarist government. This was despite the fact that Zazulich did not intend to inspire others to commit acts of terrorism, and throughout her later life she argued against the use of individual terror. After writing this pamphlet, Stepniak then returned to Russia and stabbed to death the head of the Tsarist secret police. He then left Russia and never returned. So, in the wake of this, in 1881, the book Underground Russia first appeared as a set of anonymous articles in the popular Milan daily newspaper Il Bungalow. It was turned into a book in obviously Italian in 1882 and first translated into English the following year. Its publication preceded Stepniak's arrival in England in 1884. The book capitalised on a growing interest in Russia among English readers, obviously, but not from a critical point of view. The American journalist George Kennan had published a popular travel account of Russia, and he didn't write critically about the Tsarist regime until the end of the 1880s, which is after this book became more popular. An interest in revolutionary activity had grown during Zazulich's trial, but it soon waned, especially when the news that she'd escaped to Europe and wasn't doing anything exciting anymore. The press aren't interested. Russian political exiles had lived in London since the 1850s, but Underground Russia was the first book in English about the revolutionary movement, written by a revolutionary and targeted at a Western audience. So the articles that came the book included a couple of essays on Russia and the terrorism, 8 revolutionary profiles, 5 revolutionary sketches, and the full text of the open letter sent by the terrorist group Narodnaya Volia to Tsar Alexander III after they had assassinated his father Alexander II in 1881. The Narodnaya Volia assassination was the result of a long campaign, attempts to blow up his train, his carriage, an exciting affair involving a cheese shop, which is something funny. The profiles look at 5 men and 3 women. 4 had been members of Narodnaya Volia, although 2 had been arrested and executed before the assassination of the Tsar. These four were Sofia Perovskaya, Gizia Gelfman, Valerian Lasinsky, and Dmitry Lizagub. Stepniak also profiled Yakov Stepanovich and Dmitry Clements, who were prominent in the 1870s propaganda movement, and Vera Zazovich, who I mentioned earlier. The odd one out is perhaps his eighth subject, who is Pyotr Kropotkin, who's the famous Russian anarchist theorist and who always opposed the use of violence, wrote a number of important books on anarchist communism. And Kropotkin at the time was in a French prison, and he was released and arrived in London in 1886. So, in all but two of the profiles, descriptions of the physical appearance of the subject are prominent. Stepniak turned a popular stereotype of revolutionaries dressing badly on its head in his description of how Zazovich and Lizagub dressed. Contemporaries as well as historians have accused the propagandists of the 1870s as dressing so badly in their efforts to fit in among peasants and workers that they looked ridiculous and were regarded with suspicion. This supposedly contributed to their failure to encourage a popular uprising. Some young female radicals in particular dressed in black, cut their hair short and wore coloured glasses in order to stand out and to shock. Stepniak, however, used dress as a physical symbol of his subject's commitment to the cause. He described Lizagub as dressing even more poorly than the others, despite the fact that he came from a wealthy family, so that he could donate all of his money to the cause. He reported that Zazovich dressed badly because she spent too much time thinking about theoretical issues. Stepniak emphasised the practical benefits of how they dressed, more money and more time, which was part of his wider efforts to deconstruct the stereotype that all revolutionaries were only interested in themselves and that their efforts at self-sacrifice were pointless. So out of the 8 profiles, Stepniak depicted his subjects as extreme and unusual in their behaviour and personality in all but one. Gizia Gelfman's profile is the shortest, and Stepniak only showed her in a supporting role. This quote in particular from the book illustrates Stepniak's description of his subjects as being particularly unusual and exceptional. Each individual embodies a specific quality that made them suitable to lead the revolutionary work. This allegorical organisation is constructed using his 5 male subjects, which are also the first 5 profiles in the book. As well as only showing Gelfman, who's one of the women, in a supporting role, Stepniak depicted Perovskaya and Zazovich as having stereotypically female traits, describing Perovskaya as an excellent schoolmistress and nurse, and Zazovich's inability to lead others because she was too shy. So Stepniak's idealised revolutionary organisation shows that he thought men in particular were better suited to the most important areas of revolutionary work and leading of the revolutionary movement. His descriptions of their personalities in the profiles also suggest they have always embodied such values, using descriptions of their childhood and early life. This placed these qualities beyond the reach of ordinary people and helped to suggest revolutionary work, including terrorism, was only meant to be carried out by specific individuals. Underground Russia is key to understanding how Western audiences understood and interacted with Russia and Russian terrorism. It was an international commercial success. There were 4 editions in England, 3 in America, as well as translations into French, German and Yiddish, as well as obviously the original Italian. Stepniak only received £25 in November 1882 in return for the exclusive rights to Underground Russia. But his rise to fame by writing about Russian terrorism in Underground Russia and his essays for important periodicals and other books meant he received an advance of £150 for his 4th book, The Russian Peasantry, in early 1887. The publishers of The Russian Peasantry intended to recoup this profits that were due to Stepniak, but they never did, and they were still trying to recoup it from his estate after his death in December 1895. In his comprehensive biography of Stepniak, John Bachman has argued that The Russian Peasantry was a significant book because Engels read it and was interested in Stepniak's ideas and found someone through his contacts to translate it into German for publication. However, The Russian Peasantry was, at least for his English publishers, a commercial failure, and in terms of building his reputation among a popular audience, Stepniak's Underground Russia was far more significant. Stepniak also helped to found the paper Free Russia in 1890. This paper was the organ of the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom, which was made up of English members, whereas the editorial staff of the paper was all Russian. Stepniak was the first editor of the paper. The paper did not promote terrorism, which fits in with Stepniak's depictions of terrorists as particularly exceptional or unusual individuals, and no major terrorist incidents occurred in Russia during the years Stepniak headed the paper until his death. However, terrorists did play a role in establishing revolutionary credentials. The account of Leonid Shishko, who is in the circle in the picture, the account of his escape from Siberia in November 1891 came with the endorsement of the dead terrorist Sofia Borovskaya that his commitment to the cause was chemically pure. Shishko then came to join the group in London. Throughout this period, the paper also raised money to assist revolutionaries who had been involved in terrorist movements, who were living in exile in Europe, who had to move frequently, and they needed money to do so because the foreign governments were hostile towards them. Despite the efforts of the Russians and the English supporters of the cause, Free Russia and the other publishing efforts carried out by this group in London were never financially self-supporting. In the annual reports of the Society, its president constantly complained about the lack of funds. A small number of large donors appear to have propped up the paper as opposed to widespread subscriptions. An American edition was set up, as well as a German language edition based in Zurich, with each paper appearing to have curated its own content. As well as their efforts, they tried to construct a transnational propaganda machine with a Russian language version of Free Russia planned, and the London group also arranged to smuggle propaganda material into Russia via Scandinavia. The letters from Francis Jackson Garrison, who incidentally is also the son of the William Lloyd Garrison, the famous American abolitionist, campaigner, women's suffrage and social reform. His son, Francis Jackson, managed the American edition and asked the London group to organise a regular letter from St. Petersburg as they believed it would attract subscribers. This sort of appeals to Stepniak, the way Stepniak represented himself as an insider to the revolutionary movement, and shows the significance of this type of writing and how they believed they could make money for their cause. Stepniak never did actually admit being a terrorist, and there was a sort of reveal in one of them, I can't remember which periodical it was, but I suppose an anarchist wrote an article in which he sort of outed Stepniak as a terrorist, but he never did actually admit it. In terms of Stepniak's influence on English literature and popular fiction in this period, most studies have tended to focus on his 1889 novel, Career of a Nihilist, because the secret organisation in the novel is similar to depictions of terrorist conspiracies in other novels. These studies have tended to look to the context of European anarchism and particularly Fenian terrorism to explain the proliferation of terrorist characters. Both of these factors were perceived to threaten the stability of the British government in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Fenian terrorists were New York-based Irish nationalists who were carrying out bombing campaigns in England, and many European anarchists also lived in London at the time, due to the government's quite relaxed attitudes to foreigners who had emigrated for political reasons. Many of these studies also refer to the use of the term nihilist without really interrogating what it meant to English readers. Michael J. Hughes has argued that Stepniak gave Russian terrorism a moral, political and social legitimacy, meaning that after the publication of Underground Russia, English readers no longer considered Russian and Fenian terrorism in the same terms, that they no longer associated Russian terrorism with this sort of destructive tendency. Recent studies by Robert Henderson and Charlotte Alston have also identified popular engagement with the causes championed by Stepniak. There were mass rallies in support of political prisoners and religious sectarians in London in the 1890s. In 1892, Stepniak also wrote an article in which he argued that anarchist political violence had nothing in common with Russian political terrorism. He also argued, though incorrectly, that there wasn't even anarchism of the philosophical type among Russians. They, obviously, with looking at Kropotkin, the famous anarchist theorist, this is true. I'm going to use this particular example, the dynamiter, to look at how Stepniak's underground Russia, rather than his novel Career of a Nihilist, influenced the representation of terrorist characters. So, the dynamiter is part of a series of connected short stories written by Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife Fanny de Griff Stevenson. Declan O'Donnelly has argued that the book was probably written as a result of financial difficulty, and that was why it appealed to popular fiction about popular stereotypes about terrorism. It depicts an image of terrorism as destructive and without political meaning. For example, this could be drawn from the fact that Stevenson expressed sympathy for Irish nationalists, but he criticised the use of terrorism in England. Whilst he depicted terrorism following sort of tropes that Stepniak proposed, such as the secret conspiracies in underground Russia, because they don't appear at all, there's no organisation apart from this allegorical organisation. The language Stevenson used to describe those committing acts of terrorism shows some similarities for that used by Stepniak in underground Russia. Firstly, he gave a group of terrorists the name Destroying Angels, and in a later part he describes the terrorist as thinking of his own actions as revenge. Stepniak called Zazulich the Angel of Vengeance in underground Russia, which became an important part of her public image, even if she didn't accept it personally. Stevenson also described the star of dynamite bringing salvation to his people. This idea of terrorism, the messianic vision of terrorism, is present in Fenian terrorist propaganda. But some Fenians were also looking to Russian terrorists as inspiration for their activities at the time. It seems that Stepniak was influential in introducing some ways of writing about terrorism in England that was distinct from other contemporary influences. And whilst it's only one case, I think it demonstrates the need to reconsider the influence of Stepniak's writing on English fiction about terrorism at the time. So to finish, in the preface to the second edition of his novel, Career of a Nihilist, Stepniak wrote that if I chose the characters of my novel and laid its action along the extreme or terrorist section of the Russian revolutionaries, it was simply because it seemed to me better suited to my artistic purpose. His critics accused the novel of being a piece of terrorist propaganda. Stepniak never intended his writing to encourage people to become terrorists, but he was never really able to escape these accusations that followed him throughout his career until his death. But he did also take advantage of this image as a terrorist insider to sell books, articles, and newspapers. His writing about Russian terrorism was hugely influential both among his supporters and among critics of terrorism. He rehabilitated asceticism and emphasised the exceptionalism of his subjects, which turned their abnormality into a virtue. He wrote about terrorists without encouraging terrorism because he... this was in a way of attracting supporters, such as Robert Spence Watson, who was a Quaker, but one of his most active supporters in England in raising money and speaking on behalf of the Russians. So without encouraging violence, he managed to separate terrorists from terrorism. And because of the reputation he built on the success of underground Russia, he was able to pursue other propaganda and theoretical efforts, but none of these were successful. And finally, yes, underground Russia did influence recognisable representations of terrorism in English fiction that are unique.
Lastly on the panel we have Daniel Simpson from Royal Holloway, University of London. Daniel's paper is titled Abnormal Enthusiasms, the Religious Politics of Madness in 19th Century Cornwall.
Thanks for having me. Sorry for the slightly hyperbolic title. I want to begin this paper today with one of my favourite angry quotes from the 19th century. It comes from an observation made in 1820 by the Cornish Anglican clergyman Richard Holloway, who had recently witnessed a so-called revival of religion in Cornwall, in the town of Durham. In terms which portrayed his intense hatred for the Cornish Methodists, Holloway described the scene of the revival thus: distracted raving, wallowings on the ground, piercing shrieks and groans, dancing and other absurd gesticulations, and wild ecstasies. The claim of many deluded people to the prophetic spirit, the wild assertion of others that the place of torment had been open to their view, as well as the mansions of the happy, and at each place they had seen the spirits of those long departed hence, so they were seeing heaven and hell. And then he continues, the effects very soon attended on these enthusiastic proceedings were violent brain fevers, premature labours and abortions, temporary derangement to a very alarming extent, and settled melancholy and absolutely fixed insanity in many who before were able to maintain themselves in decency and respectability. Free exclamation marks. So reading between the lines here, Holloway thinks this is a little unusual. So in my paper today, I want to explore a few of the themes suggested in Holloway's polemic, and to explore the history and context of this passionate dislike of Methodist revivalism in Cornwall. I want to argue that the text raises some very interesting points about the construction of abnormality in 19th century England, and Cornwall in particular. For the purpose of our discussion of conceptions of deviancy, attacks such as these, which were common throughout the 19th century, are an example of the dialectical construction of acceptable religious behaviour. In the second half of my talk, I want to pick up on this contemporary importance of this medical argument to explain eccentric religious behaviour. We see, for instance, mental derangement is very strongly conflated with physical illness. The shrieks, groans, brain fevers, labour, and abortions described above. So the context to all this was the unequal popularity of Methodism in 19th century Cornwall, where church attendance was high and religious revivals, such as those described by Holloway, were frequent, and among the most frequent anywhere in the country. I think there are a couple here in Durham. According to the 1851 religious census, of the 49% of the Cornish population at church in the day, 32.5% were Methodists and only 12.6% Anglican. John and Charles Wesley had first introduced Methodism to the county in 1743, after which its considerable uptake saw the emergence of many different forms, including the teetotal Methodists, Protestant Methodists, the New Connection, the United Methodist Free Churches, the Wesleyan Methodists, the Primitive Methodists, and Bible Christians. So it's a bit like in Life of Brian with the People's Remedy Day. So all of these groups, the Wesleyan Methodists were notorious not only for being the most popular, but for their enthusiastic engagement in revivalism. A very common event at the time, revivals occurred throughout the Cornish 19th century, from the Great Revival of 1814 to smaller, more local effects which extended at least until 1880. Revivalism could break out at any time, and was known also as religious enthusiasm, which is a pejorative description of those who think they're directly being influenced by God or are possessed. So several common features were usually apparent at revivals. People would sort of turn up quite suddenly, there'd be a lot of people, and they would sort of exhibit very strange behaviour, so dancing, singing, speaking in tongues, crying uncontrollably. Several reliable accounts from Methodist as well as Anglican clergy attest to the fact that revivals could go on for days. The Cornish landscape was as a result still very noticeably embellished with Methodist chapels, which often had to be built very quickly as a result of the outbreak of revivals. Sometimes you find two or more in the same town, and sometimes even next to each other on the street. So this is an example of one that seems to be built quite quickly, is to become destitute. There seems to be a topless man in the background, who might be a Methodist. But, so anyway, so while the Methodists in Cornwall and elsewhere were highly supportive of religious revivals and the large congregations they would gain as a result, the sheer scale and enthusiasm of their activities attracted considerable notoriety throughout the 19th century. In Cornwall, where Anglicanism, the Church of England, was already on the way, the revivals of the Methodists threatened the Anglicans not only on a competitive basis, but on a foundational one, bringing, as they did, the entire notion of religious faith into disrepute, at precisely the time when secular rational empiricism and kind of enlightenment reason was reshaping many of the nation's established power structures. It's also true to say, however, that extracts such as Holloway's from the first slide, by labelling Methodists enthusiastic, they could turn enlightenment logic and reason to their own advantage by comparing themselves favourably with the Methodists. The weird nature of Methodist revivals in fact became of international concern throughout the 19th century. In 1813, for instance, the political demagogue and popular radical William Cobbett made an angry attack on the Methodists, complaining that their heavenly gifts, their cause, their canting, their inspirations, their feelings of work, of grace at work within them, and the rest of their canting gibberish are a gross and outrageous insult to common sense, and a great scandal to the country. It is in vain we boast of our enlightened state, while sects like this increase daily. And in terms which this is about as rude as the 19th century gets. He says, the incoherent trash, the downright balderdash that these gifted brethren send forth surpasses all description. And it really is a stain upon the national character. They should find such multitudes to follow after heroes. So the particular problem about this proposed was indicated earlier in Polwheel's extracts. So people who had before been able to maintain themselves in decency and respectability would sort of congregate in chapels, exhibit very strange behaviour, and thereafter go back to their normal lives. The multitudes would follow the heels of these hated Methodist preachers. So it's sort of the transitory state we saw in the keynote, where people, they're normative, and then they become extremely abnormal, and then they become normative again. So, in some ways, this bedeviled argument people were clinically strange. There we are. So in some ways, the ambivalent nature of Methodist behaviour at the time echoed the equally ambiguous nature of the Enlightenment. Cobbett's trying to argue that there's a singular enlightened state, and he's saying this is something we should live up to. But scholars now would say actually the Enlightenment is a series of arguments. It's an argument at the time. Many people claim the threshold of Enlightenment logic. People such as David Hampton, a contemporary scholar, have shown the Methodists themselves consider themselves both enlightened and enthusiastic. So there's a bit of a crisis in how normative behaviour is defined. So I'm using a couple of quotes here. What's important about that is it shows you the dialogue in the discourse at the time, and they're all quite entertaining. The non-conformist press, who we haven't seen thus far, embodied many enlightened values, such as a contents-page and index, very well-written chapters, correct grammar, punctuation, and a significant focus on development of scientific theories, even though they're religious. It was here also that vindications of revivalism and enthusiasm were often made. The most common argument put forward in periodicals such as the Wesleyan Methodist magazine was that the Methodists were simply the most passionate views in the Christian faith, and that it was not therefore very convincing for the Anglicans to say they were abnormal because they seemed to really believe in religion. So there was sort of a threshold where if you really seemed to believe in God, you were seen to be a bit unusual. In 1833, for instance, one Methodist minister wrote to the Christian Observer in a reply to recent remarks on the enthusiasm of Methodists. And he insists the Methodists are not conscious of deviating from the evident principles of the Church of England. With considerable ingenuity and niceness of distinction, you might succeed in establishing some shades of difference between us. But it's difficult to conceive that the Church of England could extract from the acknowledged standards of Methodist doctrine, and here it's quoting, such extravagancies and heresies as no pious or judicious churchman would wish to introduce within his fold. And he continues, so when there is reason to believe that the Holy Spirit is graciously poured out for the communication of these blessings, there is much in the mode of expressing powerful emotions. It seems the part of a truly enlightened wisdom to bear with rather than, for the time being, evident to oppose. So what I'm trying to show you is that there's this crisis in enlightenment sort of normative behaviour. The Methodists are perfectly capable of writing very clear and coherent responses to justify a very eccentric religious practice. The Anglicans would be, and people like Cobbett, with the amount of bile that's coming out, sort of show themselves to be the most unstable at the time. Just for a little pause, this is something we still see today in sort of evangelical religious practice. Tends to be an American phenomenon, perhaps. So just a way of thinking about the mass character of religious practice. And then ISIS is something where, what was it in the 19th century called religious enthusiasm, seems to have morphed into what we now call religious extremism. So while this is a much more violent expression of extreme religious faith, the idea that people are taking this too seriously or becoming irrational as a response of sort of belief in deity, I think there's some parallels. Here we see a sort of a Western convert to Islam. So there's also this idea of people could quite quickly become unusual and go do something that's completely out of character. So in the second half of this paper, I want to trace the development of the peculiarly medical arguments used to address the problem of religious enthusiasm. That religious enthusiasm opposed to 19th century Enlightenment thinking. As such, I always want to claim development of a much modern physiological and pathological thought owes its origins to contemporary religious schism. This is to argue that for many Anglican commentators, the ability to align themselves with scientific knowledge and to claim the Methodists were simply unwell was a very effective means to undermine the supposed religion. So this is to draw your attention back to Cole's quote again, where he's talking about brain fevers and people sort of prematurely giving birth, which, you know, we can sort of imagine as an exaggeration. But his argument was a common one among the Anglicans, those Anglicans who sought to attack religious enthusiasm. Depended upon the theory of the mind and body are essentially a dualism. So the physical symptoms expressed by people with revivals could be attributed to mental instability, and whatever affected the body could also affect the brain. The disease nature of revivalistic attendants could therefore be put down to the corrupted state of their minds. But the problem this leaves is how to explain the fact that so many people who were before and after perfectly healthy collectively become diseased and collectively attend a revival and become mad all at once. So, for this reason, I think much 19th century thinking on the physiology of eccentric behaviour actually focuses upon the concept of contagion. We see this argument being fleshed out as early as 1814, when an Anglican doctor from Falmouth, aptly named James Cornish, published an article in the Medical and Physical Journal entitled Remarkable Effects of Fanaticism on the Inhabitants of Several Towns in Cornwall. He had recently witnessed a revival, and his goal was to denigrate Methodists by labelling them collectively diseased. So he writes, a convulsive epidemic has recently made its appearance in Cornwall, which has extended its effects over a considerable part of the country, to several thousands of individuals. The disease is remarkable for the manner in which it has been propagated, with the singularity of many of its symptoms, it's medical terminology. Religious enthusiasm has been the exciting cause, and this has operated with a degree of violence, of which none but naiveness can form an adequate idea. Cornish is, however, at a loss to explain how this disease is propagated, and he relies upon something he calls the principle of the medium of the emetic principle. So you see someone going mad, and you become mad yourself. And there's a question there: who's the first mad person? So what's noticeable is he lacks the kind of scientific knowledge infrastructure to really make this an effective claim. And unfortunately for him, the Methodists soon, pour scorn and mock him. So later in 1814, a very popular and charismatic Methodist minister in Cornwall, Francis Truscott, published a response called On the Revival of Religion in Cornwall. And referring to the revival that Cornish is talking about, he says, perceiving that the subjects of this change were still as capable of eating, drinking, sleeping, labouring, thinking, and conversing as we ever knew them, and observing also most conspicuous improvement in their habitual cheerfulness, we never even suspected they were diseased till Mr. Cornish pronounced them so. But as he's a gentleman of science and practice, and our minds are of the very lowest order, in compliance to our oracle, we will, at least for the present, suppose this phenomenon of disease. And this goes on for about 15 pages of just very sarcastic mockery. So Cornish has really left himself open to this because he's not able to really scientifically explain the principle of contagion and mental illness. So we see in the early 19th century, it's not really sufficiently developed. But to begin sort of wrapping up, I want to move on to what happens later in the century, and this is not just Cornwall, this is elsewhere. So between 1835 and 1885, the foremost authority written on the physiology of the nervous system is a Unitarian psychophysiologist called William Benjamin Carpenter. Much of his work was an attempt to prove the existence of man's divine will in this context to a growing reductionist and mechanistic sort of model of the functions of the mind. And the ability of cerebral reflexes to manifest supposedly conscious behaviours. So he's looking for the divine will in the context of mechanistic science of the mind. However, Carpenter also used supposedly secular theories of the mechanical actions of the nervous system as a means to attack religious enthusiasm. It's in this context that abnormality as a term came to be used more often in relation to violent muscular actions. So in this diagram, we see Carpenter's method of resolving the difference between reflexive movements, such as when we draw our hand away from heat, with volitional movements, which arise from the operation of the will. So he says your spinal cord, your ganglion cerebrum can affect automatic or reflex movements, but only intellectual processes of the will can lead to volition. So Carpenter's created a model for explaining how religious enthusiasm might arise, when the ability of the will to act volitionally is superseded by sensory ganglia, etc., these weird phenomena of revivals take effect. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, carpenter spheres were being used to attack religious enthusiasm. Some writers seemed genuinely concerned about the untoward consequences of religious zeal. In 1859, for instance, the Journal of Psychological Medicine and Mental Pathology warned religious leaders to keep all abnormal manifestations of emotion in check, as a nerve from religious enthusiasm to murder and suicide was a startling but inevitable step. And actually there is a sad story in Cornwall, which is actually, I think, unique in Cornwall, where this little girl suffocated her baby brother because there'd been a revival and she wanted him to go to heaven. She was so convinced it would be a good thing. And this was used at the time, obviously, as Methodists that are bad. But it was one instance, one extreme instance. So in the latter 19th century, you also see very partisan attacks on religion using carpenter's theories. So Dr. John Chapman, in a book he called The Natural History of Christian Faith, used carpenter's theories to attack religion in its entirety. So he says, Carpenter's physiological knowledge helps us to understand how that form of hysteria, which is originated by powerful impressions first in the brain, should be especially characterized by a normal and extreme muscular action. It also justifies us in predicting that when persons are subject to religious terror, the force and extravagance of their muscular manifestations will be greatly or subdued in proportion as their general nervous systems are healthy. So he's saying people who perhaps are already a little bit unstable, the Methodists are kind of tricking them, and they're becoming very ill. But then he writes, the disease, which as we have said is epidemic, being most swiftly propagated by sight of the infected, is usually followed by great nervous frustration and general loss of strength. So he's saying it's kind of it's a visual disease. One of the ways you propagate it is through sight, presumably maybe they could disease you by touching you or something. So just to finish, we sort of see very late on in the 19th century, and in some ways today, there's very little way to kind of explain what's going on in revivals. I wanted to argue the modern inheritance of psychopathological theories, Carpenter's kind of ideas of the nervous system, seem to derive from quite a divisive religious context, with Anglicans trying to find a way to kind of subdue the really weird behaviour of their Methodist counterparts. And this in turn, I think, has got something to do with the very divisive and very subjective nature of Enlightenment logic, and the necessity at the time to try to live up to it. Thank you.
Jennifer, would you like to come and join us up here? Thank you to all three of our speakers for those fantastic presentations. Questions?
Questions for Ms. Jennifer. So first of all, thanks for this one. It was really amazing to find out that this idiomatic expression has been used in such a wide variety of social and cultural contexts. But I was just wondering whether it has also been applied to infertility and complications and pregnancy. Sorry if you covered that. I might have missed it.
Actually, no, I couldn't find any instances like that. It was usually to do with, if applied to women, which it very rarely was actually. It was to do with women who slept with people outside marriage or before marriage. And it's surprisingly infrequently used to refer to physical ailments. It's usually mental illness.
Thank you.
Laura, I was wondering how extreme aestheticism fit into the sort of anarchist narrative. Did art for art's sake turn into violence for violence sake? Or?
I think that's kind of the perception, is that a lot of these anarchists are acting for violence for its own sake. Especially Russian terrorism sort of undergoes a revival in the early 20th century, and that's the criticism that's levelled at it more then. I think in my research, looking to explain how people interacted with terrorism and sort of understood it beyond that initial shock of violence. So hopefully through my research I'll be able to answer that question. Thank you. Martin?
It's for Lara as well, actually, and thanks for all the 3 papers, they were really interesting. I've never understood, Lara, why Wilde wrote his first play, Vera the Nihilist, but I think maybe you might be explaining it for me. Have you looked at that play yet in your work and thought about what Wilde was doing with it?
I have. It's kind of a complicated work, isn't it? Because it's anachronistic. It's set at the start of the 1800s, but it's about its main characters are Russian terrorists, but whether it's really about Irish nationalism, it's so complex. Yeah, so I have read it.
It doesn't get written about much, does it? At all, Vera the Nihilist.
Well, it's not performed, is it? Which is its performance is cancelled because of the Tsar's assassination, and then they try to put it in a theatre in New York, but then that closes after a few weeks, I think, in 1883. So I have looked at it, but I perhaps haven't engaged with it so much at this stage because it is such a it's quite a niche, I guess. It's not widely known.
No.
I was going to sort of pick up on the Wilde connection. I thought what you were saying about the costume and the dress element of the terrorist identity was fascinating, and almost like this idea of kind of a terrorist dandyism or a kind of chic way of constructing yourself. And I wondered if you could see that as a sort of an alternative form of aestheticism, sort of challenging the elitism of aestheticism, or whether there's something you think that might be described as a sort of terrorist aesthetic, if you like.
Well, there's an interesting example from the trial of Vera Zaslich, in which her lawyer wants to dress her up in a big fur cloak and pretend that she's this romantic heroine, but she's quite sure that she doesn't want to come across as that. And I think from the descriptions in Stepniak's work, he describes them as dressing badly, but then he also describes Korowska as dressing neatly and simply, and just sort of there's an element of plainness as well in that, and sort of just blending in. So I think there are some performative aspects of dress, but they do encourage this criticism that they're just look ridiculous, or they're just doing it because they want to kind of reflect their activity. But I think they're quite, in Stepniak's particular representations of them, he's quite conscious of that image and is trying to depict them as, in perhaps a more muted kind of way.
Daniel, I was very interested in the picture you gave us of this reaction against the Methodists being somehow emotionally incontinent, and that this is a bad thing, that you could love God too much, you could be too enthusiastic. And I was wondering if there's anything to say there about the drift towards natural theology from the Anglican point of view, which is looking for objective scientific evidence of God, whereas the sort of the Methodist way seems to be much more focused on individual subjective religious experience. And maybe that's a bad thing because it's sort of maybe got a bit of a democratizing impulse, as opposed to the Anglican point of view, where you have this sort of small elite of people who are experts in these things, who tell us what the evidence is and maybe regulate not only the emotions but other things of their congregations.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right. To talk about Carpenter, so I said he was a Unitarian, so his idea is kind of God's will is manifest in all things. So there's no particular sort of miracle you have to expect, and no one's going to be themselves very sort of like the chosen one or something. So yeah, it's kind of this kind of quite sober, somber religious belief, which they think, natural theology, I suppose, it's a similar idea of everything being apparent and God kind of working behind the scenes. There's this idea of, I think, moving towards a more rational scientific empiricism after the 1830s. But the other thing, which I didn't have time to go into today, is the relationship between Methodism and political radicalism. So a lot of writers then and now, like E.P. Thompson, talk about this sort of millennium, I can't even say it, millennium. I don't know. Well, they think the millennium is going to come and mouse through direct. So there's this idea that basically the apocalypse is about to happen, particularly before and after the French Revolution. And there's this idea that if you're becoming super possessed and things, if you're quite politically unstable, you might go on and do anything. So there's sort of an establishment idea that people should be dissuaded from acting so strangely. But yeah, no, I'd like to think more about natural theology because I haven't understand.
I want to ask each other questions.
Of course, yeah.
I was quite interested, Daniel, in your discussion of what was his name, Cornish, his critique, and the critique of him as being unable to explain the mechanisms of contagion, especially considering how early it took place in the century, because of course they hadn't discovered germs then, they hadn't discovered how disease was transferred, the map of the sort of established cholera as a waterborne disease came from the 1860s. So I was just interested in how that critique functioned, given that they knew there was disease transference, but no one knew the mechanisms of transfer. So it's interesting.
Yeah, there was sort of the cholera sort of pandemics after the 1830s were making people think more about the etiology of infectious contagion. Are you asking how partisans were, what methods they were using to combat this disease?
I was wondering about the critique of Cornish's idea of transference of madness and how they worded the critique, given that very little was actually known about disease transfer.
That's an interesting question. And I'd have to actually read more into it. I think that they sort of avoided going into that in a way. They weren't trying to say the imitative principle is substantially incorrect. More, they just said we never even thought they were diseased. So in that sort of very extraordinary rebuttal from Truscott against Cornish, he uses all kinds of devices to say why he's unusual. He's saying, well, we think they're healthy, we think they're acting fine, we're reasoning with sport, but I'm not sure whether they ever go into actually the mechanism of imitation, except to say he does conclude by saying, we think actually if we are diseased, Cornish could do a little bit of our disease because it might make him a little bit better. So they might say actually people were imitating each other and coming together was quite a good thing. So maybe they wouldn't entirely refuse it, but might refute why it would be inconvenient. But frankly, I'd have to go and read it. It's very interesting.
I actually have a question for Jennifer as well. So when you obviously you're talking about the increase in the use of the term screw loose across the century, is your argument sort of that the rise in industrialisation of the 19th century sees that term then being used with increasing frequency, as you said, but could it also be partly because if the term already existed in, talking about horses and all of those other things, it would just sort of come naturally to then, as soon as there was actually a physical screw, with this increased machinery, there was sort of an opportunity to use an idiom that it sort of, I'm not phrasing that very well, it had sort of already existed, but then it was a new application.
I'm not sure that that's true. I think it was first applied to horses because the slang of screw existed already, but screw loose came quite late in the 18th century, so it was already industrial, and you already had this idea in philosophy of animals being sort of automata, even at the very beginning of the 19th century, and when you saw the rise of it. So I do think it came already in the late 18th century as a mechanic, but based on earlier slang.
Any other questions?
Can I ask you a sort of similar question now? One of the things I thought was really fascinating was the initial predominance of the phrase being used in terms of institutions and that movement towards the individual. I wondered if you thought anything about this tension between the individual and the institution in the 19th century, and whether something could be going on there.
I haven't thought as much about it as I would like to. I really am interested in looking at that because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to see whether they're using the metaphor in relation to one person or a couple of people in a party, or whether they're referring to the Tory machine as a whole. So that is a very intriguing question, and I need to think about it some more. Of course, political parties lend themselves to having this getting used because there already existed the idea of a political party as a machine, which is still an extant definition. We can talk about machines as in large institutions and political parties. So they lend themselves because you could have the double entendre on the word machine and talk about there being disagreements in the machine. But that's a very intriguing question. We will need to give the separation between the individual and party some more thought.
I have a question for Lara about Russian terrorists. Could you perhaps expand a bit more on the point of sort of like each one of these terrorists represented in the book having like these intrinsic character features and qualities that sort of proved that they were sort of the right leaders for this kind of really courageous, extreme activity that ordinary workers or peasants couldn't engage in, specifically in relation to sort of practices concerning the body and self-control and restraint over the body. Is there anything about that? Because, for instance, I know in Chernyshevsky's famous novel, there's sort of a lot of ideas concerning eating practices and sort of eating as indulgence and restraining from eating. And for instance, the main sort of this hero, Rakhmetov, he doesn't eat anything bad, but he has this cigar habit which he indulges in, this kind of symbol of orality, and he like only lets himself eat peaches at some point when he's in Petersburg or whatever. And sort of the main female character is known for like her indulgence in cream, and there's all these sort of kind of food as having this like, and the body and indulgence having this symbolic meaning regarding to like your revolutionary potential. And was there sort of anything about like the body and everyday practices sort of proving how good a revolutionary you could be in the Underground Russia book?
Not so much. I mean, there are a few references, I think. One important theme in the sort of self-denial aspect is abstinence from sex, but that doesn't feature a lot in Underground Russia. He talks about revolutionaries being separated from their wives and lovers when they're abroad, and as that being part of their commitment to the cause. And so I think that does feature, but it's not the it's not a sort of central part of their sort of giving things up, I guess. So I guess it's a way in which the body is controlling themselves. But that is a really interesting question. I really don't have any answers to that. I think that's probably something I should go away and think about a bit more.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much to our panelists for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you for all your questions.